So 9th edition gave us Leagues of Votann and then World Eaters, but in 10th edition and beyond, what are Games Workshop going to realise on the tabletop for us next? Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a video to talk about new armies and new ideas in Warhammer 40k, and specifically go through a list of most likely factions to see new codexes or miniature range releases at some point in Warhammer 40k's future. Adding in new factions and armies to Warhammer 40k isn't really anything new. It does seem likely to happen at some point given that Games Workshop keeps on expanding things more and more. Perhaps partly due to 40k really expanding in popularity and scope over the past few editions, Games Workshop maybe has been a bit more emboldened to make big plays with new armies and add in more content to the game. It's certainly likely to be an easy short-term win, as releasing an entire new army means that there's plenty of new miniatures that people could go out and buy. Plus it's pretty exciting as well. Getting entirely new armies added in really does shake things up a bit, and keeps the setting feeling fresh, even if the things that are being realised are stuff that's been established in the lore for a long time. Over the past 10 years or so, we've had really quite a lot of new armies come and go. Imperial Knights weren't a thing until relatively recently, at least by 40k standards, and then we had small range releases for Harlequins and Deathwatch. The Adepts Mechanicus weren't even a thing that you could play before. The Genestealer cults returned from days long past. Death Guard and World Eaters got realised as their own thing independent from the core Chaos Space Marine Codex, as did Chaos Knights, Adept Custodes, Black Templars as their own standalone thing, and the Leagues of Votann basically being the Squats reborn. Again, an army that people would have thought might have been on a meme list somewhere, but not really something that Games Workshop was actually likely to do. I'm sure the first thing that a fair few people might say is that they'd preferred for Games Workshop to actually get around to updating the armies and ranges that they do have, perhaps things like the Aging Grey Knights range, or actually trying to finish off Eldari with all the kits that they still need redoing. Though I think from Games Workshop's point of view it's quite clear that they tend to do a balance. Big established factions do get releases, and major ones as they come and go. The ones that more people collect tend to get more attention than the ones that tend to be a bit more niche, but they do get stuff. And it looks like Games Workshop basically divides their effort between their established factions and pushing out and creating and developing new ones. It's perhaps something that can't really last forever, and they're going to reach saturation point at some point, I guess. They do tend to consolidate things from time to time, like say Harlequins being folded into the Eldari Codex, but it does mean that there's likely to be things coming next, and it's interesting to think what they might be. For this video, with that in mind, I thought it would be interesting to ask you guys which ones you think are the most likely to come back. I basically sent out a channel poll with 2 different polling questions, asking you which ones you thought Games Workshop will be most likely to release next in terms of new codexes added into the game, and then a backup poll to ask which factions you'd most want to see in game, perhaps looking at which ones might be the more popular choices if Games Workshop did choose to release their miniatures. I thought we'd go through a selection of the ones that got voted the most likely, and I've chosen to go through the top 12 of those, but these were just a few of the other options on the poll that got more or less attention. Several mini armies that you can kind of field forces of on the tabletop right now, but I guess could be pushed out and developed more if they wanted to, or a few things from the lore in 40k's past. For the Imperium, they could develop rogue traders or Sisters of Silence, but I feel like both of those maybe feel a bit more appropriate to be kind of sub-armies alongside other things, rather than their own independent fighting force. Militarum Tempestus, I'm sure Guard players would like to see a bit more support for. Maybe we might get some sort of Scion-themed detachment when the book comes out. And I thought I'd mention Elysians on the list as well, a fairly niche but much loved little Forge World range that were previously a thing but then went away. A specialist drop Imperial Guard regiment with some sort of similar themes to Scions or Stormtroopers. Otherwise for Xenos, there's a lot of things from 40k lore like Rod, Zotes, Rakgol, or some sort of Skaven but in space. A fair few of the more old school 40k races tend to be fantasy races ported into the setting like Eldar Elves and Orcs, and now I guess we've got a bit of a return to form to that with the return of Leagues of Votann. Otherwise, Rebel Grots could be a fun one, though I guess that might make more sense to be a sub-range within the wider Orc army. You could do Eldar Corsairs, and they had some representation from Forge World before, or maybe a sort of Town Mercenaries or Auxiliaries codex, maybe one that could be used by multiple different races potentially. Otherwise, for Chaos, Fallen are certainly something you could do something with. Luthers are out there and might get a model at some point. Khorne Demonkin were a Chaos army of the past, or you could have some fun with the ancient technological horrors of the Men of Iron, or some sort of new reimagined version of other human empires like the Interrex. There's quite a lot of options out there, and among these fringe choices, these were a few of the ones that were either more popular or more likely, though mostly less so than the other things on this list. I feel like a few of those might be a bit more likely to just stay represented by their kill team type things. We already have that for Corsairs or Rogue Traders. I feel like Fallen could be a really interesting one if Games Workshop wanted to do a kill team box set for them. I'm sure that would be quite well received as a mini force in the lore. It would be really quite cool to see some actual official, nicely made models for. Getting into the races and armies though that you actually voted the highest, I thought would go through in terms of order of likelihood, and 12th on the list was Legion of the Damned, getting a 9% expectation vote. In the lore, these guys are basically sort of mysterious Imperial demon kind of Space Marines. Mysterious origins, maybe including being the Renegade Firehawks chapter or being one of the Erased Legions whose names we don't know. Whatever they are, they appear as spectral Space Marines, appearing unbidden in impossible scenarios, unyielding silent spectres that just ignore enemy damage and purge the foe with bolts made of hellfire. After the battle, they mysteriously vanish as soon as they've appeared, and Games Workshop did have some interesting miniatures for these guys that were available in metal for really quite a long time before going away in 40k's not too distant past. I say that these guys are a force that Games Workshop are never realistically going to do as an actual army release, but again they could be an interesting one for a single kit at some point. Again, they do seem kind of perfect for a nice kill team type box if Games Workshop wanted to go that route, and then maybe you could field them as Imperial agents as you often could in the past, an allied squad of these mysterious spectral Space Marines to add to a main force. I feel like that seems kind of cool. The desire for them seems at least fairly high, and they ranked 8th on the poll for ones people most wanted to see. Seems that people are a bit uncertain as to whether or not Games Workshop are actually going to bring them back in any sort of big way though. Definitely seems like an option that they could release a box set for if they chose to. Next up we have the Kroot. These guys are best known for their working with the Tau Empire, so they basically are a small alien empire of their own right, fighting from their home world of Peck. The Tau first encountered them after they were locked in a very long bloody conflict with the nearby Orcs, which they helped the Kroot to drive back. The Kroot are kind of an avian birdmen type species, with carnivorous and cannibalistic tendencies, being able to absorb genetic traits of their conquered foes by eating their bodies, literally gaining strength from the foes they vanquish. Like the Elysians, the Kroot had a small Forge World range that was kind of niche and wound up getting cut, probably due to lower sales than other things. They brought a few other Kroot units to the battlefield, including things like the Greater Narlock and the Narlock Riders, sort of like Krootoxes but bigger and cooler. As for Games Workshop chance of a standalone codex for them in 40k, again I'd say that's pretty much slim to none chance at the moment. I think people find them fun but not really so interesting compared with the actual big established races of Warhammer 40k. You do get occasional people out there who've collected entire Kroot armies, which is all well and cool, but I feel like perhaps they had their chance for interest with Forge World and it just wasn't really quite there. I can't really see Games Workshop going the whole hog and releasing them as a full faction. What does seem more likely though, and good news for Kroot fans, is that it looks like Games Workshop might well be redoing the Kroot range with the next Tau Codex that's coming in spring. I've already seen what looks like a confirmed shot of a Krootox Rider's big gun. Hopefully alongside that there shall be new Kroot Carnivores, and maybe a new Shaper. It'd be very cool if they went bigger than that somehow, but fully updating the models that are out there already would definitely be a good start. In terms of fan desire to see a Kroot army range, they seem to be a little bit lower than most, 14th overall in my poll versus 11th for likelihood. Perhaps most people are just happy to see them maintain their status as Tau allies, and if there's some way to field them as their own independent sort of army within the Tau book, I'm sure plenty of people will jump at the chance. Next up and voted 10th most likely are the Eldar Exodites. They got a 15% on the expectation poll. These are the Eldar that have sort of gone rustic, realizing the horrors of the fall that were coming ahead of time, fleeing their decaying and depraved empire to settle on verdant worlds, live a bit more simply, and then were largely far from the epicenter of the civilization's collapse, and survived that way. They use a world spirit in place of an infinity circuit, and while they often don't tend to be as mighty or technologically advanced as their Craftworld or Drukhari cousins, they can still be formidable foes to fight, known to often make use of indigenous fauna to carry them into battle and overcome invaders. Unlike Legion of the Damned or Kroot, they've never had any official miniatures from Games Workshop to my knowledge. They do tend to be one of the armies that I have seen kit bashed a few different times, all sorts of creative things using fantasy kits, sometimes great winged beasts to represent things like Crimson Hunters or Flyers. Definitely an army that you could make look kind of spectacular if you wanted to. For Games Workshop's chance to release, I feel like we've got even less likelihood of seeing miniatures for these guys, perhaps than the two ones that were mentioned before. Eldari definitely do have a solid following in Warhammer 40k, but it's perhaps not so great to the extent where it supports multiple other factions. We've just seen Games Workshop roll the Harlequins back into the core Eldari Codex, as they were maybe one of the most niche factions in 40k before that. I feel like it's just very unlikely that Games Workshop will go down the route of pushing out another Eldari faction when they've just decided that it doesn't really make sense to sustain the extra one that they had. It's also not like they've really found much will to update the Eldari range over the past many years. They did get a big release in 9th edition, though even this still leaves them with one of the older ranges in 40k, with loads of resin things or things that went out of production, still waiting updates. Fan desire for them seems to be higher than most though, they rank 6th on my poll there. I guess the idea of Eldar riding dinosaurs is pretty cool. Otherwise, and tied with the Exodites for likelihood, were Ynnari. These also scored a 15%. Ynnari are a much more recent creation, basically the followers and worshippers of Inniad, the Eldar god of the dead. A hope that the race has long had since the birth of Slaanesh, that as each Eldar dies, the god of the dead rises in strength and will be finally the thing to vanquish Slaanesh once and for all, and stave off the otherwise inevitable doom of their species. The Ynnari became a thing not too far in 40k's past, Yvrain forming a coalition that comprised of both Craftworld Eldar, Harlequins, and some Drukhari, though some certainly rejected them like the Homunculus Covens, and then used their death magic to essentially restore Rabute Gilliman to fighting health in the events following the fall of Cadia to resist Abaddon's onslaught against Terra. Since then though, Games Workshop doesn't really seem to have developed their story or fleshed it out beyond this. They just kind of feel like they're sort of sat there as the presumed next stage of the Eldar. But most of the releases following this maybe haven't been too heavily themed towards them. They do have a few nods with different options for unhelmeted heads, and Games Workshop do occasionally release them and showcase them in Ynnari colours, as well as just things like Aspect Warrior colours, say with the release of the Howling Banshees. They do of course already have their own unique set of miniatures in the ones that originally released as the Triumvirate of Inniad, the Vizark, the Incarn, and Yvrain, and you can still use them in game at the moment to create a fusion army both out of Craftworld Eldar and Drukhari. So basically do represent an army in game more so than most other things right now. They arguably don't really need all that many unique miniatures to make that happen. I feel like it's kind of likely that Games Workshop just keep them within Codex Eldari as one way that you can field them, redone with each update and addition. I guess it's not impossible we might see a few more unit releases for them, but it might well be second priority in a lot of people's minds compared with just redoing the Craftworld Eldar units, while there's things like old school resin, swooping hawks, fire dragons, and warp spiders. Ynnari might be second priority to a lot of Eldari fans. They did rank kind of lowish in terms of fan desire to see them as well. They only scored 12th most popular on the poll. I think in general a lot of people see them as a fun way to build an army, but not necessarily something that they want to see Games Workshop turn into an entire new army that's actually supposed to rival things like Craftworlds or Drukhari in game. Next up, and voted 8th most likely, were the Death Corps of Krieg, in the lore basically an Imperial Guard regiment from their world as the brutalized post-nuclear hellscape that it is, having fought a millennia-long war to remain loyal to the Imperium that left a lasting impression on the planet's populace. Now they have little more to offer the Emperor other than their Imperial tithe, raising regiments for the Imperial Guard as fast as they can, and the regiment is famed for their almost comical and absurd sense of dour duty and willingness to sacrifice themselves for the Emperor, to the extent where it generally causes issues and communication problems if they're posted alongside other regiments from other worlds. They tend to specialise in mass infantry backed up by heavy artillery and guns, often deployed in a siege warfare sort of capacity. I think Krieg are one that's definitely burned bright in people's minds as perhaps the single most popular Forge World army, so much so that unlike Elysians, Renegades and Heretics, Kroot, or Eldar Corsairs, there's actually a fair few miniatures of them left, though even these have been gradually pared down over the years with the least popular kits going away one by one. They still have Death Riders in very expensive resin and some resin Kriegsman miniatures too. Though Games Workshop did release the Veteran Guardsman Kill Team that was a Krieg 1 for Kill Team, and that was really quite a nice way to get some plastic models for the faction. Overall, with the way that Games Workshop now approaches Imperial Guard regiments, I think it's very unlikely that we get Krieg as a standalone codex, but on the other hand it does seem downright likely that they'll get some more miniature love in the future. A few of the rumour engine things have been looking potentially very Kriegy. from Games Workshop's recent Advent engine, and given that the Deathcore Riders have been so popular that they're still getting sales despite being some of the most ludicrously overcosted 40k miniatures out of any of them, they do seem like a very solid choice for a port into plastic when Games Workshop gets round to them. Would be fun if they did decide to resurrect any other things from the Forge World range, things like Combat Engineers or Grenadiers. I guess it's possible, but I maybe wouldn't be too hopeful on that front. For miniatures you'd most like to see, they came in 10th on the poll. I feel like perhaps realistically, as people would rather have them part of the Imperial Guard Codex as opposed to in their own book, which might just be a bit excessive. Next up and 7th on the list we have the Harlequins. These Eldari are the enigmatic guardians of the Black Library, travelling amongst the other Eldari and Drukhari as performers, and when they make war it's with holosuits, flip belts and mirage projectors so the opponent has no idea where they are, dancing through the enemy ranks as a great performance, delivering death in perfectly choreographed blows. Despite their oddly performer-like appearance, they are some of the deadliest fighters in Warhammer 40k in the lore. Harlequins are maybe a bit of an oddball, as they do basically still have their entire current army range. They have their standard troop box, 3 other standalone characters, the Voidweaver and Skyweaver dual build, and their own set of jet bikes. Over the past few editions they have had their own codex or at least standalone rule set, and they even got things like mask rules in 8th edition, and then rules for their Sadaths of Light, Dark and Twilight and Luck dice things going on in 9th, though in 10th edition Games Workshop has rather roughly just pushed them into the rest of the Eldari Codex and given them basically no unique way to field them in terms of detachments or anything. They were perhaps fine with Deathwatch as maybe the least played armies in Warhammer 40k, so as armies to roll into other factions they maybe were quite a logical choice. But it still sucks for people who'd built up entire collections of Harlequins, as basically it means that their rule support is rather sidelined and mothballed. They're not really looked at so much as their own thing to independently balance when Games Workshop looks at that sort of stuff. They're mainly more seen as units that you can field within Eldari now, so far less customization than you had before. My guess is that when Codex Eldari comes out, there will probably be a Harlequins themed attachment that could give you back a bit more of the flavour and actually encourage you to put a force that's mainly Harlequins or all Harlequins on the table. In all honesty, I feel like Games Workshop probably should have been a bit more generous and given you that detachment right from the start of the edition, as opposed to having to wait until whenever Codex Eldari eventually comes out. I guess seeing as they are an army that already have their own miniature range, and did have a codex in the very recent past, they are still one of the more likely ones that could get a new codex in the future. Games Workshop could choose to separate them out again, and it might only take, say, 1 or 2 kit releases to make their range feel a lot more well-rounded. Though I feel that given their niche status, and again plenty more Eldari and Drukhari things that desperately need redoing, it's probably not going to be high on the priority list. They do maybe feel like a faction that has generally more operated as small groups of allies in the lore in the past, as opposed to literally full-fledged armies that take on entire enemy formations all in one go. It just doesn't really tend to be something that happens very often unless something threatens the existence of the Black Library itself, such as when they fought the Thousand Sons in the Webway. For fan desire for them, they were one of the higher ranked ones. They ranked 5th on the poll overall there. I'm sure there's plenty of people who want them back or want them to be their own thing again and better supported. I guess detachment rules would go some way to helping start with that. Moving on, and voted 6th most likely to get their own standalone army, are the Inquisition. They were a bit ahead of the Harlequins with a 27% on the expectation score. These guys are the unquestioned arbiters of the Imperial rule, basically able to requisition armies, govern planets, and take any secret or weaponry for themselves as they need it. To defy their authority is to defy the authority of the Imperium itself. The Inquisition are most famously split into 3 great ordos: the Ordo Malleus against the demons, Hereticus against witches, psychers, and insurgencies, and Xenos that handles the alien threat, though there are plenty of minor ones as well, and they might command either inquisitorial stormtroopers, retinues of specialists that they build up from planets that they work with, and to some extent they often have their own militant wings, such the Grey Knights tending to work with the Ordo Malleus or the Death Watch with the Ordo Xenos. In-game, they've been one of the factions that's been sort of hovering on the edge of being a mainstream 40k faction for quite a while. They do have their own miniature range, mainly just characters of the individual Inquisitors themselves, things like Inquisitor Kotias here, or the more recently released Kyria Draxus, who turned up with the Psychic Awakening campaigns. In general, their rules have usually been themed to be able to field 1 or 2 retinues of specialists in alliance to another mainstream Imperial army, as opposed to actually operating as the entire force themselves. I guess perhaps the main question is if Games Workshop actually wanted to be able to allow you to field an army of agents of the Imperium as their own thing and fighting under their own flag, as opposed to just being allies to other armies. And I feel like in reality it probably wouldn't take too much effort to allow you to do that. You could use all sorts of kits from various different factions, maybe making use of things like Imperial Guard Chimeras or Space Marine Rhinos for transport options. And doesn't seem unreasonable they might be able to work with various wings of their Inquisition, certainly the Death Watch, maybe the Grey Knights, perhaps having some Sisters of Battle joining in the hunt for some witches, and then maybe have an army emphasis focusing on things like their Inquisitorial henchmen retinues. They could do a release for perhaps some Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, clearly denoted as their own thing, and use other Imperial agents that we already have rules for, things like Exaction Squads, Navy Breachers, or Rogue Trader elements perhaps. At least per the launch of 10th edition though, it seems that Games Workshop want to keep them as allies as opposed to an army in their own right, so unless they made a big move and decided to change things around, it's probably going to stay that way. I feel like they're one of the factions that could credibly turn into a full army if Games Workshop really wanted them to though. Maybe a bit more than some of the other things mentioned further up the list. I remember Kotiaz had a teaser at the end of the Arcs of Omen sequence as well, given that it sounded like he was going to unleash something major. I guess that could certainly tease a new miniature coming for him at some stage, given that his own is a little bit dated. Could be an opportunity for other Inquisitorial miniatures to come though. For fan desire for them, they were 7th on that poll, so kind of similar to their expectation likelihood. I feel like you could definitely do something with them, though it's maybe a little bit uncertain as to what sort of final form that would actually take. Next up, and always a popular one when talking about new factions to add to the game, are the Renegades and Heretics. Lots of things that you could call them, also going by Lost to the Damned, or maybe just Traitor Guard in general. These guys are the mortal followers of Chaos, and are an absolutely classic foe in Warhammer 40k lore. Really quite a lot of conflicts, basically being against Imperial planets that have gone rogue and fallen to the ruinous powers, sometimes with the help of Chaos Space Marines, but it's pretty easy just for humans to get corrupted, maybe even more so than Astartes in the current setting. In the past, they've had a few interesting different forms. They did have an old Lost and the Damned Codex once upon a time, with rules for squads of mutants and things. They had a Renegades and Heretics army list from Forge World, with rules for things like Renegade Psychers and Chaos Ogrins and plenty more. And currently in Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop seems to release a fair few Mortal Chaos follower type things. Over just the last 2 years, we've had releases for a Traitor Guardsman kit that would be an absolute staple in an army like this. The Enforcer with his Ogrin bodyguard, which are really quite fun miniatures, and also some mutants and abhumans. We've got Chaos Beastmen now, with the Felgor Ravager kill team, plus the Cultists and Accursed Cultists from the Chaos Space Marine range. Again, they feel like units that could easily be press-ganged into a Renegades and Heretics style army, completely independent of any Space Marine oversight. The Dark Commune, again, I think fits particularly well for this kind of role. As ever, when these sort of lists come up, it does seem like one of the more logical and more likely ones. A fairly common army that people tend to convert, maybe just converting their guardsman armies to have more spikes and more chaos iconography. Sometimes using other factions' rules like maybe Genestealer cults or even orcs to represent them, depending on what sort of theme of army you're going for. I can't help but think that it might be a bit of a big project if you did want to realise a fair few loyalist type guard units and things, but more spiky and more heresy in feel. And it might take a bit more effort than things like the Chaos Knight kits, which only seem to revolve around just a few different kits for their range, but definitely feels like it could be a possible army to release if Games Workshop wanted to in the future, and does really feel like something that should probably be out there, given how abundant they are in the lore. As you might expect, they're pretty much one of the most fan-requested factions, ranked 3rd on the poll overall, definitely a popular choice. Maybe the issue is, though, that they're not the first Chaos faction on the list, and there's a couple of others with a chance to steal their limelight. Otherwise, for potential Codex or army releases, if Games Workshop did want to expand even further on the Space Marine side of things, there's always the possibility of fleshing out the individual Chaos Legions or Loyalist chapters with more in-depth miniature ranges and model releases, much as they've done with armies such as World Eaters or Thousand Suns, or Loyalists like Blood Angels or Space Wolves. The deity-specific legions seem to be rather inevitable for the Chaos Space Marines, though I guess it's not entirely impossible that we could see things for the Undivided Chaos Legions. So that's be Black Legion, Word Bearers, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Iron Warriors actually getting a bit more support in 40k, as well as just Heresy releases. The factions have some strong archetypes, and their lore is very well known, and I feel like fan desire for at least some sort of representation of these on the tabletop is pretty high. They often had some unique character miniatures in the past, like Night Lord's Lords or an Iron Warrior Warsmith, but now most of these just don't have anything whatsoever, bar a few things like Abaddon or Harlequin Worldclaimer, or this upcoming Night Lord's Kill Team kit that was really quite well received by fans of the army. I feel like perhaps the thing that holds this back most, though, is that there's just quite so many of these guys. It's maybe not 100% clear where they'd start about going out about releases of these books, and even if it's really a good idea in the first place. Particularly in 10th edition, Games Workshop's really trying to make army choice being more driven by individual units that you pick on the board, and then detachment choice for different ways to play them. So things like supplement books and codexes, as we saw with the 6th Loyalist chapter supplements like Ultramarines and Salamanders in 8th and 9th edition, just seem to be unlikely to be a thing. They'd be kind of unlikely to get more than detachment support in terms of extra rules. And even if Games Workshop did have a big desire to make every single one of these interesting and unique with their own unique miniature range characters and unique units in a similar sort of way to, say, Death Guard, there's just really quite a lot of these armies. It would basically be developing 6 new ones at once. And it might be kind of a bit of overkill of choice, really, when you've already got 3 or 4 deity legions, plus the core codex that's kind of supposed to unify the rest. I feel like perhaps what's more likely is the return of the demon primarchs that we still know are existing. Lorgar and Perturabo could certainly come back whenever, and there's always a good chance that Alpharius was able to slip away somehow. Plus I think a first good start will be things like these kill team kits they've done for the Night Lords. If each legion could get one of those as a start, I think that would be a good thing. Plus just maybe some unique character support for the legions beyond Black Legion. As a counterpart for the Loyalist character releases, it'd be nice just to give one miniature to have the army have a bit more flavour. I feel like perhaps the part of the reason that these guys were voted highly on the polls as well is that Chaos Space Marines don't actually really have any good representation for their own legions. Everything fights kind of the same under Index Chaos Space Marines right now, and hopefully that'll change when the Codex comes out, and there'll be some themed detachments to represent their different fighting styles. Otherwise, in a similar sort of vein, there's the same thing for the Codex compliant chapters. These ones seem to have been voted slightly higher likelihood by you guys, I guess given the past precedent of us having things like the Salamanders, White Scars and Iron Hands codexes coming out in late 8th edition. I guess there's very slightly more rules that you could put in those sort of books. The Ultramarines have their own cast of characters, and these guys have at least got a little bit of model support already, having their own unique character and upgrade sprue per chapter at least, occasionally a little bit more. Again, like the Chaos though, they just seem kind of unlikely to happen in 10th edition given that Games Workshop's doing detachments as their way that they do different chapter rules these days. Realistically, they're not going to be launching entire miniature ranges for each one of the 6 Loyalist chapters, though I guess they could develop them a little bit more than they have. And outside of that, it's just hard to imagine what an individual codex book would really add at this point, unless it's just literally extra detachments that are themed around that force. Seems like when Games Workshop makes the next big effort to release Space Marine models, after Dark Angel's big release it might be Blood Angels or Space Wolves next. Though I guess with Loyalist Primarchs returning one by one, eventually we might see a few of these guys come back, say Vulcan or Khan or someone. And I suppose that could be a good way to reimagine part of their army if Games Workshop chose to. In terms of fan desire for these, they didn't rank particularly high either, 13th on the poll overall, maybe just because they're a bit more predictable and don't really feel like new armies. And I'd guess that they ranked so far behind the Chaos Legions just due to already having some good representation in game, whereas the Chaos Legions don't right now. Next up and ranking in second place was Dark Mechanicum, and in terms of people thinking which factions are actually likely to turn up in game, these guys are a significant massive jump above all the rest so far, voted at 65% likely to turn up at some point by you guys. These will be kind of the Chaos mirror for the Adeptus Mechanicus, heretics in service of Chaos, that allowed a lot more freedom and creativity than their Loyalist counterparts as a result of their allegiance with Chaos, fusing Xenos tech into their creations and able to dabble in the creation of demon engines. Potentially it sounds like an excuse for some pretty fun and wild miniatures. These guys have had a few fringe miniatures, things like Negavolt cultists in Blackstone Fortress would probably fall amongst their ranks. That's the chap with the wires that you can see on the top right. And now we've got a deity for them to worship in Vashtor the Archifane, who turned up towards the end of 9th edition. I feel like there were at least quite a few people who were speculating whether or not he might be the first outrider of a more wide, creepy chaos technology type range within 40k. Overall, out of the new armies that they could add to Warhammer 40k, they do seem like one of the very most likely. They've certainly been a fan favourite in recent years. I remember I did a similar poll to this about maybe 3 years ago on the channel, and they were one of the ones that came out ahead. And 10th edition could be the time, with Vashtor's Arcs of Omen narrative having him set off to find some sort of great big super weapon. Maybe a Dark Mechanicus Reawakening could go along with that. It'd be kind of interesting to see where they fit in within the greater Chaos range of 40k though, given that they've already got quite a lot of heretical technology. Things like Venom Crawlers, Obliterators, Chaos Knights and Soul Grinders all exist. They do have quite a lot of wild demon engines out there. Will be interesting to see what Games Workshop did to make them different and stand out from all that. Finally, last and perhaps the most simple and obvious one is the Emperor's Children. Maybe not the most interesting part of the poll, given that we know that they're almost certainly coming, seeing as that we've had Death Guard and World Eaters in the not too distant past. We've already got Thousand Suns, and if Games Workshop want to complete their Chaos Legion pantheon, then that would be just the Emperor's Children left to represent Slaanesh. They are, of course, the pride-filled legion of Fulgrim dating back to the Horus Heresy, falling heavily for Slaanesh due to their pride and desire for martial excellence, and in battle they make good use of stimulant drugs, sonic weapons, and extra enhanced senses, all to greater take in the din of war. Previously, they've had very dated miniatures for their Noise Marines and Lucius the Eternal, neither of which I'd say were ever particularly good kits in the Games Workshop range and have needed an update for literally decades now. And Fulgrim himself already has this past precedent from his own Demon Primarch miniature that came out for the Horus Heresy range. There seems at least some chance that it might be Games Workshop's Mystery Codex they've teased us for next year, unless there is just something a bit more disappointing like a run-of-the-mill one that they haven't announced yet. And it does seem that you guys pretty much agree that they should be the next one to turn up for 40k, voted easily the highest on expectation, and also the first in terms of fan desire to see them as well. Hopefully Emperor's Children players won't have too long to wait. In any case, that just about brings us to the end of the list, and to talk through 12 possible factions that Games Workshop could add into Warhammer 40k, some of them a bit more or less likely than others. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What would you most like to see turn up into the 40k setting as a fully fledged codex? Do you think that we're due for Emperor's Children and then eventually Dark Mechanicus? Or is Games Workshop going to drop us with some sort of curveball? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments as per always. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. And if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that the channel does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.